My name's Steve Bolt. I'm a lawyer from around these parts and I'm facilitating this session today. The focus of this session is international experience of reforming the drug laws. As everybody is generally aware, there's been a lot of change overseas. We can't be so happy about saying there's been a lot of change in our country, in our state. A few things maybe, but a bit slow, always a bit slow. But we're on a path. There's no doubt we're on a path towards a better world, a less intrusive world in terms of government regulation and government control of drug use, or are we? And in a way, that's the essential question today. How much is changing the law a change for the good? How much does that create unintended consequences? It's a bit indulgent maybe to be thinking about the right way to change the law and how maybe we should. It's a good problem to have, I suppose, about how should we change the law. Any change is, I suppose, a good thing from a perspective where we're coming from. But the international experience is always useful. As I said a few minutes ago, we're privileged to have a collection of people from various places. Ray Thorpe, not from such a far way away. Ray, a local. Those who were in the session just a moment ago, Ray is the founding brain genius behind the Happy Herbs organisation and has been an advocate for sensible drug policy around cannabis and other substances that may or may not fit on one side of the legal line, and for many, many years, and has been active in that area. So we're local, but with an international perspective. Sita von Windheim is a person from Canada. Welcome, Sita. Sita is a long-term activist in Canada. She has an aromatherapy background and is interested in cannabis and other stuff from that perspective. So it's always interesting where people come from. But welcome, Sita. We have Fiona Patten from far away, but not that much, 1,000 Ks, Member of Parliament of Victoria for the Reason Party, and in my personal opinion, the most sensible and ethical politician in the country.
Spiritually, I'm a local.
Just my thought. Just my thought. Independent member of the Victorian Parliament and an incredibly effective member of Parliament, I might say. Charly, I'll get people's names right, Charly Bedrossian, next to Fiona, from the Cannabis College in Amsterdam. So we all know about Amsterdam, hey? Charly's the expert on Amsterdam, so anything you want to know from him, he'll be able to tell you. And at the end, Redbeard, who's got another name, but he's known as Redbeard around here, also a Canadian, a person with, again, experience in the changes to the laws that have now led Canada to be a place where cannabis is legally available, but not without some strings attached. So what I'm going to ask people to do is make a short statement at the beginning, give everyone a chance to warm their vocal cords up in the morning. So each of the panel members just to say something about what they want to say, but I've asked each of them to say this, I don't think I asked Fiona, to make a comment on what they think might be the biggest mistake that's been made in another country on the road to law reform, either their own country or someone else's country. And at the end of the session, then we'll have some question and answers, just open up to the floor. And then at the end, I'll ask people on the panel to comment on what they think might be a solution to the problem that they've identified. So we're going to go there. When we get to the comments and questions from the floor, this place is lovely, but the acoustics are shocking. So unless you have a microphone, no one will hear you. So there'll be a roving microphone. If you want to speak, by all means do. Put your hand up, and we'll get a microphone to you, and please wait for the mic before you ask your question or make your comment. Having said that, that's enough. I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes and ask Ray to tell us something about what he wants to tell us about.
I'll be using it later.
Part of Ray's supply.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm glad to talk on it because, as you know, we've really been behind drug law reform, but drug law reform, rational drug law reform, where drugs, all substances are made available, regulated, taxed and under prescription, and with a bias on natural, because anyway, eventually America, which brought on all the drug laws in the first place. They were first in some states to change the drug laws there, but they haven't got a good model at all. When I was sitting there on Venice Beach, and then there's a light plane trailing a great big advertisement saying, "Get your buds here." And I'm thinking, there's families and kids, this is not right. But how wonderful it was to go into a cannabis store. How wonderful, chocolates, brownies, everything you want, lemonade. So we bought lemonade, and my partner at the time, who's very sensitive to THC, we were glugging down the lemonade, and I said, hold on a minute, let's see what the dosage is. Well, the bottle was 300 ml bottle, and the dosage was 10 mils. And this is why any drug law reform has to be regulated, because it's unregulated, it's silly. The lemonade tastes so wonderful that you wanted to have the whole bottle, which would be a 30 times overdose. So then I bought chocolate, and I have the chocolate, and of course, when you have, well, I can't have 1 square of chocolate. You know, you'll have 3 and maybe 6. And then when you looked on the fine print, on the lemonade bottle, it was fine print. I had trouble reading what the dosage was. On the chocolate, I couldn't find it for a while, and the chocolate was 1 square. What if you ate half the block of chocolate, which we do when we have the munchies? But more particularly in both cases, what if your child sees that chocolate in the fridge, or your grandma, or anybody for that matter? The American system is out of control, and I'm really, and I have been from that very day, concerned that it might backfire, that eventually people will be sort of reverse and change everything back again until they bring in regulation. But then, of course, I've just been to Portugal, and that is regulated, but not a perfect model either. One, because these substances aren't available, and it's not true freedom. There are still restrictions there. So there you are. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ray. Sita, your thoughts on how to fix the world?
Sorry, gather my thoughts here. On what you were speaking just now, that in California the dosages are unregulated, I think they're getting that under control. However, in Canada, the dosages are so ridiculous that it costs you would have to drink about 100 ml. A person that needed 30 milligrams a day would have to drink about 100 ml of oil. And right now, the regulations are such that the allowable dosage in 1 bottle or one capsule is so low that it's not really serving medical patients. So, and we haven't even seen the new regulations that are coming out for legalization. We think that the dosages are going to be very low, that you have a whole chocolate bar and it's only 10 milligrams, and that's not serving people who need it for pain. And we don't have right now in place a 2-tier system where you can order high-dose chocolates from the medical system and low-dose chocolates from the recreational system. That's not in place yet.
Thank you. Fiona.
I mean, the question of which country is doing it badly, well,
Yeah.
I mean, we really don't have to look far. Australia's really leading the charge in how to do it wrong. And it seems that we are not learning from the experiences. And yes, I mean, we saw probably California with the first jurisdiction to really come on board with a strong medicinal cannabis approach, and with a ballot in 1992. And, you know, that was the kind of sore thumb approach. But we've gone to the other we haven't listened to anyone. We haven't looked at what was a good regulation. We have decided that we in Australia somehow are brighter than everybody else. Most of us know we're not. But some of our egotistical politicians think we are, and we've introduced a system that is unlike anywhere else and is largely unworkable. We estimate there's 1 million people probably using cannabis for a medical or health effect, and about 5,000 of them have got a prescription for it. So what we're doing here is wrong. I took a parliamentary committee of politicians to to Portugal, to Switzerland, to Colorado, to Canada, and to California. And my motto has always been, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. And I have to say, in looking at those models and in looking where a politician feels most comfortable in Australia, it was the Canadian model that people felt that politicians could see the regulation there, they could see the controls on advertising, they could see things that in Australia we're very used to. I think in North America you're probably not used to the notion that, you know, there is no First Amendment, we don't have a First Amendment, so free speech is not a big thing here really. We accept prohibition on advertising, we accept those very tight regulations on products, be it alcohol, tobacco and cannabis. But listening over the weekend, I've certainly understood some of the unintended consequences of that legislation, which we didn't see while we were travelling.
Thank you. Charly.
Well, sorry, guy. In my personal case, I'm not going to talk about the Canadian model because we have people that actually know way better what's going on in Canada. The system we have in the Netherlands that was actually started in the 70s, started actually for recreational users and not even medical users. In this case, it's perfect for recreational users because they're not prosecuted for cannabis use. They can purchase cannabis from coffee shops. The only issue we have is that coffee shops are not allowed to produce cannabis, they're not allowed to grow it or to buy it. It has to magically appear inside the coffee shop, which is a very big hypocrisy of the system. They have obviously to find cannabis from the black market, they have to buy it illegally, store it illegally, bring it inside the coffee shop illegally, but once it's behind the counter, they are allowed to have 500 grams, sell it to people over 18 years old, and they have to pay taxes, actually on each gram they're selling. That's the first point. The problem is that in this system, medical users have been completely left behind. Users that need, for example, cannabis oil, actually for medical purposes, will be treated as criminal because making actually cannabis oil is considered as making a class 1 substance, which is technically a hard drug. So someone in possession of cannabis oil, even for medical purposes, will be actually facing the same charges than someone in possession of cocaine, heroin, or any other hard drug for recreational use, which is unfortunately a shame. The Netherlands, being one of the first countries being tolerant about cannabis use, is not tolerant about cannabis users in the actually totality or cannabis growers because, let's be realistic, if we have users, we need providers for those users. It's just as simple as
Thank you, first of all, for letting me be here. Canada, I'm very proud of the way it's gone in a lot of ways. As you said, you know, we're one of the first countries to legalize. There's a lot of good to it. You know, we're almost there. There's a lot of regulation that everyone has to go through. But to answer the question, what is the most wrong, I would say, just as a small business owner myself, I don't think the government wanted or tried to get any small businesses in on the legalization. They really just opened the door for the huge corporations, the people that were well organized, very well funded, you know, with their own lobbyists and their own action groups. Those people had a major head start. Now, true personal citizens like myself certainly could have been right in there as soon, but I would have, again, must have been well-funded, super organized, on the ball, ready to go. So, I mean, it is an inclusive system, but what we could have done is much more to encourage small businesses, all those mom and pop operations that we used to have, we still do, but like the mom and pop growers, the small business growers, the small business extractors, the small business, everything from making pipes to making rolling papers to making the cannabis itself. I think that's where we went wrong the most, is not in being more inclusive. The government surely could have asked the small businesses' opinions. They could have made programs to encourage small business growth. I think that would have been very beneficial. Right now, it is really all just large corporations who are doing an okay job of it, but they're they're not growers. They never were. They've hired cucumber growers to grow the cannabis, and they've hired CEOs and bank executives to run a grow room. And the government is not very good at selling weed. They're not a very good dealer. So they had a lot to learn from us, but it seems like they didn't. So I think that's where the failing most was.
Nick, are you making a note of what he just said?
So,
Sorry, yes, David.
Yeah.
Welcome, and David
sorry,
Nickles.
sorry to be late. I think in the context of the U.S., the thing that stands out to me is that they seem to be more problems of governance than problems of cannabis. So, if we look back in '96, most people don't know the first place to legalize medicinal weed was California, which was followed almost instantaneously by the District of Columbia. District of Columbia has historically had really high HIV/AIDS rates, including, I think last I checked, it was between like 2% and 3%, which is higher than a number of places in Africa. The feds have stripped out the needle exchange programs and all sorts of things over the years. Well, because of how Washington, D.C. is structured, not as a state, in order to get legislation passed in D.C., Congress can pass all sorts of riders where federal legislation then has some impact on D.C. After the District of Columbia voted to legalize medicinal cannabis, Congress passed a rider that said if the District of Columbia violates or basically refuses to go along with any federal laws, they'll lose all federal funding. So the measure passed with like 64, 66%, but obviously never went into play. As a result, DC recently legalized recreational. Again, you run into those weird situations where nobody's really authorized to sell it, so you can walk into a shop that sells t-shirts and buy a $60 t-shirt that comes with a gift of cannabis. Now, of course, if you brought that in front of a judge, right, potentially no judge is going to buy that. They're going to say this doesn't actually pass the sniff test. And so it shifts the legal burden onto the consumers, onto the sellers, and pretty much all of the city council was able to wash their hands of it and say, look, we support sane legalization or regulation. We're just not going to get our hands dirty taking a step in one direction or the other with regards to more or less restrictions. Similarly, considering that DC has the federal level, the state level, and then questions of recreational versus medicinal versus decriminalization, what you see, once again, is that the people who are better prepared and able to come into new terrain, especially as the United States sort of legalizes or decriminalizes or goes recreational or medicinal in a patchwork, is that companies and corporations who've set up in one state, gotten their operations up and running, gotten their logistical people situated, and been able to start raking in cash, are then encroaching into other states. So when DC went legal, they were initially allowing for, I think, 5 growers, or 5 growing centers, with the intention that these would be local businesses. However, I think of those 5, 3 of them were almost off the bat out-of-state companies, 2 of which I think were California, and then, the other people who were able to come in were well-off local business folks who were already quite financially stable and maybe not looking at these ventures as about accessibility to cannabis as much as lucrative business opportunities. So looking at that terrain, to me, most of this seems to run into the problems of corporatization, capitalism, business, and governmental regulation, rather than anything specific to cannabis.
Surprise.
Yeah, surprise.
No, true enough, I suppose. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. I think maybe some questions or comments from the floor. I can't see Kath with the microphone. Maybe she's not here. Can't see much. Anyway, anyone from the floor who might want to make a comment or question, if you just put your hand up, we'll get a microphone to you in a matter of seconds. So thanks for that. I guess hearing the different experiences, you just think, well, why don't they just leave us alone, just take the law away, or, make it legal, stop making it illegal. But I think the experience of everyone, and David's comment is probably right, it's not just cannabis. The politicians, government, they can't help making regulations. They like to control. Perhaps against the instincts of some of us in the room. But anyway. Question down the front.
Ooh, I'm going to have to compete for a moment. It's got noisy outside. Across the world, most places that I know of have legislation specific for the alcohol industry and legislation specific for the tobacco industry. Do you think that part of reforming our drug laws, we need to take a look at what we've done with those other substances and maybe find a new way to control them? That it just like, are we just going to keep creating new pieces of legislation for every substance? That seems absurd. Whoa.
Could I just quickly respond? Because I think it's an interesting thing, Nick, and I mean one of the mantras that we have had in Australia for a number of years by certain groups is treat cannabis the same as we treat alcohol. Tax it in the same way, regulate it in the same way. And I don't think that's a great mantra, in fact, because, you know, the comeback on that is, and look what happened with alcohol. So I think we've got to change that mantra. But I do think those familiar regulatory models, you know, of wet taxes, of you know, taxes on amounts and things like that, actually do work, and the age restrictions and supply restrictions can work, but I think the mantra doesn't work.
Any other comment or no? Any other question then? Question or comment from the floor?
Another question?
Yep. It's a bit hard with the lights in our eyes. Free the weed, fair enough. Right at the back, I think. Oh, no, that's just
I just wanted
salute.
to say, sorry, with
Sita.
your question, one of the considerations is that if you're going to follow the alcohol model, is that cannabis has been proven to be a lot less harmful than cannabis. So if those considerations are taken into account, then I think using an alcohol model is a good start. Where we in Vancouver, in Canada, have kind of gone overboard, where we have 52 new laws that we can break, including the driving laws. Before, if you got caught, if your car smelled of cannabis, there was no test and there was no regulation. And if the police officer deemed you unable to drive, then you would have your car taken for 24 hours. But that's basically all they could do. Now there's tests. They can take you to the station and have your blood taken. They can take your car away, fine you thousands of dollars, ban you from driving. And that's not, it hasn't even been proven that driving a car under the influence is harmful. So those kind of things, what's happening in Canada and what people are concerned about, and what the law cases are that are coming up around this, people of course are fighting these regulations, including another absurd one is that if you give cannabis to a minor, so a 19-year-old and an 18-year-old are hanging out, and the 19-year-old hands the 18-year-old a joint, that could mean 14 years in jail. If that 19-year-old gave the 18-year-old a drink, I think the maximum fine is like $500.
Not real rational, eh? One of the issues I think we're facing here in Australia as activists around the question is, how much do we focus on medicinal? How much do we talk about adult use, recreational use? Do we run them together? Charly made some comments about that from his observations. I thought about the experience in Holland, in Amsterdam and so on, about how the consequence of that liberalisation approach, which is not really law reform as such in a sense, has had that
definitely the
consequence.
system we have is not the best one and not the most perfect, but since 1976 I think the gedoofbeleid, the politics actually we have in the Netherlands has proven that recreational use of cannabis has absolutely no negative consequences on society. Or you don't actually, until very recently, the Dutch government will not test cannabis for driving. They will have zero tolerance on alcohol, but cannabis testing started only a couple of years ago, under pressure actually of European Union. But before that, people actually could not drive being drunk, they could drive being high or stoned as hell. That was not a problem. But suddenly, under pressure, we started making tests. The problem is that even in Europe, those tests have been proven to give fake positive results or even fake negative results. Me personally, living in the Netherlands, I don't drive, but I do use cannabis absolutely every day. Just for the fun of it, made one of those tests and came out negative 15 minutes after smoking a bong.
Right.
Just
Go
to
figure.
prove you how effective those tests can be.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
are expensive, actually, because the taxpayers are paying for those tests at the end of the day, and is ineffective. Recreational use of cannabis should actually obviously be regulated, avoid obviously for minors, but you cannot regulate it as alcohol. You cannot just compare both substances. Actually, yeah, Sita is completely right on this. It has been proven more than one time that both substances are completely opposite. Alcohol does generate issues in society. As the Amsterdam police every weekend, they have issues actually separating people drunk in bars. Okay. We have actually alcoholic fights absolutely every weekend. The only issues they have in a coffee shop is, at the worst case scenario, someone having a whitey for smoking too much.
I'm not sure if David wanted to make a comment on the same issue or other.
Something else that just came to mind as we're sort of bouncing around this territory is, right, as we're talking about regulations in that commercial context, and I guess it also sort of highlights similarities that you could raise between regulations around like home brewing and home growing, right? Like in the US, you know, if you brew your own beer, that's perfectly acceptable as a hobby. Now, once you get into those questions of distributing more broadly beyond your family, friends, things like that, then, you know, these regulatory issues come up. But again, that's not even really about alcohol any more than it would be about cannabis, which is sort of, these are the problems when you start distributing to people you don't know. Is your bottling up to snuff? Are your processes clean enough that you're not getting people sick? Similarly, thinking about, you know, growing your own weed, just as much as growing your own tomatoes, right? The notion that you couldn't, you know, provide for yourself or your family or whomever else. Like, it seems to me as we sort of navigate this, I think it's important for great not to get in the way of good, but also I think, you know, some of the distinction between like politicians who have to operate where the rubber meets the road versus people outside of that system who can really push on that and control what the Overton window looks like, what is acceptable discourse. There are so many things that right now just don't line up, that don't hold logically when you start picking them apart, that I think there's some merit to highlighting those. Even if it doesn't result in immediate change, at least it sort of gets those conversations going around where things don't make sense, because we know none of this policy is rooted in logic or reason or science anyway. And so, not that picking it apart will instantly change that, but I think it contributes to cracks in the facade.
Thank you.
I guess I could just add to that.
Yeah, please.
It's no surprise the way the Canadian legalization went. You can really see that the politicians really had to cater to all of their voters. They're trying to keep their job while trying to legalize the cannabis. So they needed to, that's why we're overregulated, if you might call it overregulated, but they're being very careful, obviously. They're trying to keep it out of the hands of children and criminals, is their most commonly used line. And so they've come up with a very thick book of regulations to try to do just that. And to try to show their conservative voters that they are trying to do that. So I think that's the cause of that regulation, that over-regulation. And I think it's just wise to know that might be coming. So be patient, but also know that there's still work to do if you do achieve legalization. There's still work to do after that. Like we need to show them that small business can do this as good or better. We can improve the access to medical systems. We can improve the pricing, the packaging, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot of work yet to do, and I think it's valuable to point out that the politicians have this great balancing act to do, you know, and at least recognize that, whether you appreciate or respect it. But you know, it's something. At least they got it through.
That's right, and I think congratulations to the Canadians. And I was there in the Senate for the Senate hearings and there for the final vote on it, and it was that making that path where you do have to compromise. But I think it's interesting, the driving side of it, because when I'm on like Shock Jock Radio talking about cannabis legalisation, largely the people calling in don't have a problem with the legalisation, but it's driving, and it's impairment driving that they have the issue with, and too often we try and compare cannabis and alcohol, and it doesn't work, and it's not that simple, and it's one area that we really have to diverge, and we have to really teach people that the mere presence of a substance, unlike alcohol, doesn't mean impairment. And I think this is going to be, you know, and I know, I mean, in Canada you had what, C45 and C46, so one was all about driving and one was about the rest.
There's a hand at the back, up in the air, thank you.
You'll have to excuse my ignorance, but are there any tests at all available out there to measure the level of intoxication or impairment with THC?
I got pulled over about 5 minutes after I smoked a joint, and I tried to tell the officer that my last joint had been 5 hours, and he smelled my car and he said, no way. So they hauled me out of the car, and I did a very long, very thorough impairment test, and I passed them all, and the officer was dismayed, and in the end he told me, he said, you've passed all the tests and I have to let you go, but I have my serious reservations about you smoking a joint 3 hours or 5 hours ago. So I think the answer is that they just need to put in some more work and come up with some roadside sobriety field tests that actually work, not how many nanograms of product you have in your system.
The thing is that with cannabis, contrary to alcohol, you cannot actually test properly. From one user to the other, we don't have the same tolerance in front of cannabis. Actually, heavy users, like actually people like us, or a first-time user, will not have the same tolerance towards cannabis. It's very, like actually Sita was saying, you could have actually really high concentration of cannabinoids in your system and still be completely functional, or have a very low dosage of cannabinoids in your system and be completely out in a couch. That depends on users, it depends on the strains, and so on and so on. It's way too complicated actually to test, in my opinion.
And in Australia, we've never really gone down the impairment path ever since we started the random roadside drug alcohol testing, the breathalyzer testing. So and really this should be about impairment, and that is what we should be seeing the work done. And I think the Druid project in Europe has been doing some good work towards creating impairment testing, but a per se test or a mere presence test it's of no use, because as you say, as Charly says, a heavy user could be as sober as Sita was after smoking a joint 5 minutes ago. She's probably just had a joint now, and look how, sober she seems.
Perfectly fine.
One.
Yes, Ray, did you want to comment on that too?
Something. Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is working. Yeah. I believe in England they have got a quantitative test, but whether that is accurate, because we're all different, that's for sure. But I know they have one, which is a much better model than ours.
Yes, I'm not sure what the details of the English system are. I don't know if Charly or anyone else knows. So if you don't know, we won't say. There was a hand up here somewhere.
Sorry, I just want to point something out very quickly that really bothers me, is that I heard this morning our driver gets tested every time we get driven in, and I heard that each one of those saliva tests costs $75. So let's think about, we talked about the UN pushing for tests. Who is pushing the UN with their new equipment to push all this. So it's really the big corporations that are behind this in the very first instance. And unless you can find a way around them or to reject them or get your government to understand that this is a very expensive way of testing people, and maybe be better if you have unemployment to put unemployed people to work rather than giving corporations all this money.
Sounds fair to me. There was a hand.
It's me. Hi, I'm Elvie, and I just been enjoying your whole conference more than I can tell you. But I wanted to talk about Dr. Ray Thorpe with the happy herbs. I don't know, I didn't hear the whole presentation, but I wondered if you touched on the social aspects in Portugal. I know that the World Cup has always been a place where people fight and fight and fight, but once you legalized all drugs, there were signs in your newspaper for at least 2 weeks saying, do not bring alcohol into this stadium, you will not be allowed to come in, or if you're drunk, you're not coming in either. They actually encouraged that you use cannabis, and for the first time ever, there wasn't one single squabble there, but down the street at the usual bars, there were plenty of arrests.
Absolutely right. For me, it was the happiest place in the world I've ever been to. I've been to Portugal before. I'd never been to Porto, but I actually had tears in my eyes when I was driving out the other day in taxi, because everybody there was friendly. Everybody is happy. Everything is working. Everything is normalised to the extent the way we should all be living. And no, I really appreciate it.
May I say one more thing?
Yep.
I was on the road with people between 18 and 25 for at least 5 years constantly. Every fall, every spring, we did tours. And I will tell you honestly that 80% of those drivers definitely smoked pot the whole time. I want you to know that not a single one of us ever got a ticket for a moving violation. Parking tickets, there were plenty. Okay, but as far as anything serious, the other thing I've observed is that if someone has really been smoking a lot and you try to get them off that couch to go get something for you at the 7-Eleven or whatever, they laugh at you. And that's the end of that conversation.
Just to come back very, very quickly on the Portugal example. The Portugal example is a very good one in what concerns actually drug users, not just cannabis, but drug users in general. Drug use has been uncriminalized, but drug access is not. Cannabis growing, for example, for personal use at home will still be actually illegal. In the other hand, when this decision was made, they also had a huge sanitary crisis because you had a pretty high heroin use and also a high HIV actually rates that were alarmingly raising. In 15 years, those rates have been going down very recent, and I think they've proven that actually having a more logical and more sensible drug policy towards users, it was already making sense. Now, of course, the only issue, once again, like in all different countries, is how to provide actually those substances to users.
And I think Portugal, while it's treating drug use as a health issue rather than a criminal one, and but it's still, if you are picked up with less than 10 days 10 days usage in your pocket, it's still confiscated. If you're caught snorting a line in the back of a nightclub, what you've got left in your bag is still confiscated. It's not treated as a crime, but you're then required within 72 hours to make an appointment with the Drug Dissuasion Commission. You're then interviewed by a social worker or a psychologist who will then ascertain whether they think that your drug use is problematic and could do with some assistance, health assistance, or whether it's really a recreational thing and not for the state. It's a great model, and it's actually something that is politically very palatable because it's not condoning drug use. It's just saying that these people, it's a health issue, not a criminal one. And I think that mantra is now travelling around Australia, and I think you'd find most ministers and most premiers in Australia would now be saying that, not doing it, but saying it.
It's a start.
And the actual fact is too, the police aren't really policing it because it's a lot of administrative work for them, so it's a subtle change in the sense, I mean, it's still there, that's for sure, and you're not given many chances either, but the police are just, they've got other things to worry about.
So that's an interesting contrast with the States, right? Because we have for-profit prisons. We have a scheme that's basically set up where prison labor can be used to produce all sorts of goods at a fraction of the cost of normal corporations. So we have prison labor populations that are producing military goods. We have the production of electronics. I mean, when I spent some time in South Carolina jail for possession of a few grams, the tag on the boxer briefs that I had to buy from the commissary in order to have clothes while I was there, right? They forced you to buy boxers, toiletries, and a few other basics. But the tag on it says inwear by inmates for inmates, right? So even the clothing that I was being forced to buy in order to then be appropriately incarcerated was being produced by inmates at another facility that, and so you see sort of the absurd economic pressures that get placed on this. So in the US, frequently the economic issue comes up as well, that, this is wasting so much money, all these resources could be used for other things, but I would suggest it's not so much about the amount of money, but rather whose pockets it winds up in. So as Sita pointed out, with the testing, when you have a corporation that's able to push this sort of technology and say, hey, we've produced this, whether or not you feel that there's actually a social need for it, we have access to all of the governmental strings to pull to make it so that these things wind up in society. You essentially have your feedback loops working in the wrong direction. And I think that that's a really tangled, gnarly mess to try to tease apart. And, it's one of the reasons I'd say I'm glad I'm not a politician, because I can say, look, there are just problems here. I don't need to figure out what the nice political channels are and how do you get, because at that point you're back to how do you get some of this financial influence out of our social structures and out of the way that we relate with each other. And one of the biggest things that's kind of stuck out to me in the US is the way that our prison corporations, as weird as it is to say, feel comfortable acknowledging that there is this financial element, and the way that they associate not only drug-using populations, but immigrant populations. And so I think there are important questions to ask around, hey, if we pull all of these drug-using populations out of jail, out of prison, isn't there then the sort of economic incentive to increase the incarceration of immigrants, which we've seen in the U.S. as Trump and others have sort of implemented their policy. We've seen the wholesale expansion of immigrant detention facilities and a whole lot of other problematic things. Now, I'm not arguing that, we need to keep cannabis illegal so that immigrants don't go to jail. More that, again, we have these clear common causes with other populations, and that, again, these problems go well beyond just access to weed.
I think that's a perfect example of the situation where the government creates not just government, but something is created, some kind of edifice, an institution is created with buildings and staff and so on. Then they've got to find a use for it when its original intention is not needed anymore. If it's not, who else are we going to lock up? We've got all these cages, who are we going to put in them?
I was going to ask you, Charlie, the Netherlands have been closing their prisons.
Mike.
I was just going to ask Charlie about the situation in the Netherlands, because they have been closing their prisons.
Yeah, it's actually right. We have a number of inmates which is so low. We arrived to a point that some prisons are actually transformed as refugee welcoming centers. So bars have been put down actually to welcome refugees. Actually, in the center of Amsterdam, it's been the case, for example. And some other cells have been literally rented to other European countries who suffer of overpopulation in their jails. It is ridiculous, but lots of jails actually are closing down one after another in the Netherlands because the rehabilitation system that has been and all the work that has been done by the Dutch government in the last couple of decades actually works. First-time offenders really very often will not be second-time offenders. The reinsertion also in society as well. There's been a huge work on this one. Contrary to lots of countries where as soon as you had a criminal conviction, you're kind of out of society, out of getting a job, an apartment or whatsoever. No, the Netherlands have actually been making a huge work on that, and this is the reason we don't need actually jails anymore.
It just to compare, Australia has about between a 65 and 70% recidivism rate, which is our first offenders. About 60 to 70% of our first offenders re-offend. So whatever we're doing wrong. And I don't know what the States is like, but I suspect it's around that figure as well.
I think there's another question from the floor.
Yeah, you sort of covered it because you guys went on a bit of a treatment bend, and that's what I was going to ask you about. But I'll reframe my question. So in Australia, these are vague numbers, but it's about once every 30 minutes that somebody is arrested or charged for something to do with cannabis specifically. So that's a big number. It's about 19,000 people a year. I'm pretty sure that's Australia, although I might be messing my figures up, and that could be just Victoria. That is just Victoria. Sorry, yeah, okay, so the whole country-wide figures are much bigger. 60,000. I'm not going to work that in my head. But the question I'm getting to, a lot of people are obviously being caught up in this, but the other side, and we've touched on it a little bit here, but what do you think, if we do change the laws, what do we do about treatment for those who do struggle with a drug like cannabis? And those people do exist. It's not the 60,000 people that are scooped up by that criminal law system, but there are a small percentage of people who do struggle, who cannabis maybe isn't their drug, or maybe there's something else in their life that's contributing to harm. What do we do for these people?
Well, I think they should go into treatment you should have a treatment policy for all drug users. And I've seen people get addicted not just to alcohol and cigarettes and cocaine and cannabis, but also food. So that's a health issue that needs to be dealt with. It's not a criminal issue. Those people need help. They don't need to be put in jails and get sicker and learn more bad things.
Just like, for example, in the case of Netherlands, like I was explaining earlier, medical cannabis is still not available for access. So someone who does need cannabis oil could technically be treated as a criminal for actually either producing or being in possession of cannabis oil. We arrived to a point where basically making any extraction of the cannabis plant, even trying to extract CBD from hemp, is forbidden because it is assimilated to producing hard drugs, which is ridiculous. Technically, being one of the first countries in the world supposed to be tolerant towards cannabis, we arrived to a point where medical users are forced to go to the black market and have good or bad quality cannabis oil depending on the actually provider they will see. They have absolutely no guarantees at all of what they're buying, and being one of the first countries, once again, legalizing cannabis, it's a shame. The measures that were taken in the 70s were taken by the Prime Minister of the time, thinking that all the other politics following him will, one after another, bring their stone to the building to finally actually have a regulated legislation. Since 1976, we are in 2019, nothing has been done.
So I can speak to that. I forget exactly what year, I think it's 2015. In Canada, we went to Supreme Court. We have a Supreme Court in Canada, so you can make an application. And so we went to the Supreme Court because we had the same laws, and the outcome was that patients are allowed to make any extracts they wish. Any amount, there's restriction on how much cannabis patients can have, but there's no restriction on how much they can make with that amount that they can have. So they can make cookies, they can make oil, whatever they need for their medicine.
I think, yeah, which is just wonderful. I just have a quick story about Portugal. I was in the Drug Dissuasion Commission one day, and this kid had been picked up for smoking joints in the park. And he was 18, 19, and it was not his first time before the Drug Dissuasion Commission, but he was young. And so after the conversation that they had, and he was smoking, you know, half a dozen joints a day and hang out, the outcome of that was he was enrolled into a computer design course because actually he was bored and he had nothing else to do, so he was smoking a hell of probably quite a bit of cannabis each day, and he didn't have the assistance or the wherewithal to work out how to do what he wanted to do. And so I thought, so when we treat it as a health issue, when we look at that kind of possibly problematic use, Portugal was able to provide those avenues to assistance so beautifully.
And I think it's very obvious that even the treatment costs, individual treatment costs in full-time rehab are way, way less than the cost of the criminal justice system, like way less. I think there's a question from this side of the darkened room.
One of the arguments for roadside drug testing is that there's no alternative, there's no other way of testing for sobriety. There is a technology that looks at eye movement, which can be done on a handheld device that I think was developed in Canada already about 5-6 years ago. I'm just wondering why that's not being applied. I know that the mines use it. They, the trucks actually have the sensor mounted above the windscreen looking at the driver, and it alerts the management to when the driver is too tired. The good thing about this technology is that it would apply to alcohol, to fatigue, and to any other drug. Why isn't that being pursued? Why can't we use that as an argument?
I believe that the police are major shareholders in the testing devices that are being used in the roadside today. So for another company to come in there and try and dissuade them, a lot of it is based in finances. If you go back to if you follow the money. So this is a strictly a company lobbied to get these pieces of equipment to your police, and now that's what they're using, and they're not going to look at anything else.
I actually, I'll disagree with you, Sita. I think that you're onto something. I think in Canada anyway, from what I've heard, I've got some relatives in the police force. They're still looking for the answer. Right now, they've got a saliva test in Canada. It doesn't work when it's cold out. So it's cold in Canada. So, you know, they're struggling to find that device. I think that they're just still in research and development phase. I felt my family members' frustration about that because the government, the Trudeau, was really pushing through his legalization day deadline. He really had voters to please and other reasons to do that. And I'm thankful for it. A lot of us activists thought it was slow, but in the realistic world, it was a pretty quick move to legalize in Canada. And I think that they're just still trying to catch up on that. So I think that I've heard a little bit about what you're talking about also, and I think we will see something exactly like that. I just don't think they have it ready yet. Top secret technology, man. They don't want us to beat it.
It's right to us, and it doesn't get talked about enough. And I know I've raised it a little bit in my work, but it hardly got raised at all during our drug law reform inquiry. I think I was pleased to read just yesterday, Illinois, their government was looking at how they would deal with roadside, with impaired driving and with cannabis driving, and they completely rejected saliva testing and they completely rejected per se testing and didn't come up with another solution but said those two won't work. We actually need to find another solution. So I think there does seem to be that desire to find something that actually works, and the eye testing, which is so beautiful because it goes across the board and it's non-judgmental about what reason you might have to be impaired, and it doesn't ask that question. It just says you're impaired.
Yeah, I'm usually hesitant to talk about contexts I'm not familiar with, but to the extent that I understand the Australian law around this, it seems like it's not about impairment. Right, it's just about presence. So in that construction of things, it doesn't actually seem tied to driving, right? It just seems to be, here is a moment where I would assume if it's similar to the US, the legal grounds for engaging with somebody in their car are actually much lower because here you have whatever sort of public safety or less presumption of privacy in that context, so it seems like a legal inroads to then engage with people, but they're coming out and saying, you know, this isn't about impairment. And the thing that's always seemed so goofy to me is that they don't seem to care, you know, if you're essentially acknowledging possession at home. That, oh, you know, you smoked 2 days ago, well, give it another couple days. So there's awareness on the part of law enforcement that there is possession, and that's not bothering them. There is awareness that the actual tests aren't about impairment, and that's not bothering them. It's literally just an opportunity for prohibitionist policy to, I assume it generates some degree of revenue, but it's, from my perspective as a foreigner, it seems absolutely absurd because it doesn't address even any of the common talking points of prohibition, and it doesn't even attempt to present some sort of facade to do that.
I can answer you, for example, with something that has been done in Europe in the case of France, for example, in these couple of years. They've been pushing saliva tests for cannabis users, and what happens, scientifically speaking, if you use cannabis, if you smoke cannabis, you will be under the effect between 45 minutes up to 3.5, 4 hours, depending on your morphology, regular use habit, and so on and so on. A saliva test, actually you will still have presence actually of molecules actually selling over 12 hours after using cannabis. So you will definitely not be actually under the influence of it anymore, but technically speaking, you will still have presence of it in your saliva, urine, and blood. And how many drivers actually got their driving license taken away and had to go in front of a judge to justify the fact that they had been using maybe 1 or 2 tokes at a party over 12 hours before driving, and they were still technically positive. So of course, that does not make any sense. It's just
a lot of it
as simple as that.
We have a bit of time. We have to wrap up fairly soon. We've got a bit of time. But almost the main event of the weekend about to happen. We're going to be all in it. The Cannabis March and Rally, annual MardiGrass Drug Law Reform Cannabis March and Rally. We're about to do that in about some time. But we have a bit more time. I think there's one more question perhaps at the back of the room. Maybe one more?
Hi.
Maybe 2 more?
Yeah, thank you. My question is mainly to Fiona. I'm from Victoria and worked on the child state ward charges, and one of the other things that we're working on is the non-spent conviction scheme in Victoria, and I'm just wondering if that's in discussions at all about even small possession charges, that they are on people's records forever at the moment, and yeah, if there's anything to talk on that.
Thank you. I've actually got some really good news in regards to spent convictions. So just for the audience, spent conviction legislation is about clearing someone's public police record after a certain number of years when they haven't committed any other crimes, and it enables people to move on with their lives and hopefully not reoffend, and also move on to do the work that they want to do, travel, employment, etc. So I put up a bill and put the bill up for second reading a few months ago, but didn't have government support for it. The government referred spent convictions to a committee that I'm the chair of, the Legal and Social Issues Committee, on Thursday. So day before yesterday. We're to report by August, and I understand we will have legislation by September and it will be passed by October. So, yeah, so we're on our way. It happened.
Excellent, excellent.
Well, in actual fact, there is spent conviction legislation in every jurisdiction with the exception of Victoria. So we will be tasked to look at, and when I developed my bill, I looked at all of the other jurisdictions and chose a fairly conservative path because I thought that was the one that would be most likely to get through. We've now kind of got the opportunity to probably recommend a more progressive approach, which I will be hopeful we'll get through. But yes, Victoria, oddly, is 30 years behind Queensland on this.
So that will bring Victoria in line with the rest of Australia. Fantastic.
Indeed it will, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I think we might have one more or no more questions from the floor. Fair enough. Run out of things. I've got a kind of question in a sense for the panel members, and it's this. To the extent that in other countries there's regulation, like in the Americas, in other European countries, they're kind of falling away of enforcement of regulations are two different approaches. But I'm just wondering if there's any observation about the impact on the size of the black market in either of those models. What's the experience of those countries that have taken one road or a slightly different road, had an impact on the size and influence, I suppose, of the black market in terms of providing cannabis product to those what need it?
So in the US, we have, because again, we have multiple layers of prohibition. We have federal, we have state, and then we have local. We've seen regulatory patchwork that has allowed for a lot of new enforcement. Talking to friends who've been growing for a long time in California, even on the county level, after legalization, it gave the opportunity for local governments to allow their citizenry to propose new ways of dealing with this. So in Occidental County, California, I had a friend who's been a long-time grower, and she said after recent changes in the law, basically the wealthier landowners in the area were able to advocate for ordinances that made it so if you had less than 10 acres of land, you were no longer able to grow outdoors. So at that point, if you wanted to grow, you needed to have a greenhouse that passed whatever sort of regulatory muster, met the requirements for being able to be sealed off, locked. If you were growing indoors, you have to, obviously engage with the electric company. PG&E out there has been responsible for a whole bunch of fires and poorly maintained infrastructure. And so the thing that struck me about the way the US has done things is there's a lot of room for continued funding for cannabis interdiction. It's just no longer, hey, anything you're doing with cannabis is illegal. And it becomes these specific things that you're doing with cannabis are illegal. And what that has led to is continued enforcement along lines of race and class, where usually the folks who are finding themselves falling outside of the legal structure are the same folks who always fall outside of the legal structure because the legal structure was partly erected to control their actions and social engagement. So we see black, brown, and poor people are disproportionately targeted even in the new emerging legal landscape, either because they don't live in the right areas where appropriately zoned commerce can take place, or because they're in areas that have been specifically zoned for cannabis, and so there are higher rates of enforcement because police are essentially being tasked into those areas. Folks who have been disproportionately targeted by drug laws are already black, brown, and poorer folks, and so when they look for jobs within the legal industry, many of them are finding, hey, you've got a past conviction, we're not willing to hire you because you're a criminal. Now, the reason you're a criminal is because you have expertise in the field that you're applying for, but, pay no attention to that, we can't take you on, you've checked the felony box. So again, you sort of run into all of these problems that were created as a result of prohibition. And I think it's one of the reasons why it's really important for people to engage with the histories and sort of mechanics of prohibition to understand why these problems don't just disappear because you change the legal terrain. As long as cannabis or other drugs are subject to these legal controls and regulations, there's always going to be a population falling outside of that, and those are going to be the people targeted for enforcement, incarceration, and these other problems we've been talking about.
Sita.
Well, in Canada, now that we have a legal market and we have stores, the government has done a very bad job of supplying them. And it's gotten so bad that some of the legal licensed producers have gone to Ottawa to complain to the government that the black market is stealing all their business. But in any business where the legal market costs twice as much as the black market, they'll never succeed. So doesn't matter how much they complain to the government, Canada's always had a very robust black or gray market. Online, we have Canada Post ships across the country in 3 days. And sometimes if you order from the government store, it takes weeks because they're out. It's completely overpackaged. if you're an environmentalist, you know that black packaging can't be recycled. So all those kind of kinks need to be worked out if Australia doesn't want to end up with the same issues.
Thank you.
So we're reflecting on the size of the market as opposed to
well,
legalization, the black market?
I'm curious
Yes,
about the size and
exactly.
operation of the,
Yeah,
the continued existence of black
Yeah,
market.
sure, exactly. In Canada, the legal market, they've been losing a lot of money. They say they have a supply problem, yet they're not selling very much of it. And just like Sita said, it's roughly at least twice as much to order through the government store, and it's way more inconvenient. Like Sita said, it takes a longer time to get to your door. You know, your local dealer is still living next door in his mom's basement selling $5 grams.
But even if you order online, like they have free shipping. It's amazing.
Yeah,
2 days,
exactly.
anywhere.
There's a lot of mail order businesses right now. But I'd also like to reflect on they've done a fairly effective job at bottlenecking the black market. In Vancouver alone, there used to be hundreds of dispensaries. They've brought that number down to, I think it's in the 20 range or so. They're trying to get that to 0. That's the illegal dispensaries versus the legal stores. So what that's done is the black market is now flooded with growers that were previously selling their cannabis to the illegal dispensaries. So right now, anyone of you could easily go down into Vancouver and buy a pound for probably $1,000 because those growers are unable to push that product anymore. So
And
a lot
that's
of
AAA. That's AAA's. Like that's
the
buds
good-
this big.
the good stuff. You know, and then if you were to buy that from the store, that would be many times more expensive. So in that regard, the government is doing a okay job at trying to defeat the black market, but until they reduce their pricing to be more effective, there's no way that they can compete with the black market.
Cool.
About 5,500 a pound.
Spot price.
Well,
Charly.
in the Netherlands, it's pretty simple. The black market loves and says thank you to the Dutch government because technically, yes, they are the ones providing the coffee shops. Coffee shops basically will get their cannabis from either small suppliers, fathers of family or students that have a small grow tent at home and will harvest between 500 or 600 grams every 3 months just to make some extra cash, to big criminal groups who actually are growing in entire houses or importing hundreds of kilograms of hashish per month. It is, in my opinion, in the black market, easier to find big quantities of cannabis on the black market than small ones. That's ridiculous. Yes, you want to buy 200 kilos, 50 kilos, no problem. You want to buy 20 grams, I don't want to cut that. Literally, even the black market dealers are becoming lazy. It's becoming actually to a serious point. But no, more realistically speaking, yes, of course, the system we have has just been actually promoting the black market because coffee shop owners have been forced, not by choice, but just by the way the system has been made, to
So it's our
actually
system too.
provide themselves to actually what we call the black market. Now, in what concerns users, lots of users, unfortunately, Amsterdam is still a very expensive city. If you want to live in Amsterdam, just so you can roughly figure it out, a bedroom sharing apartment with someone of 12 square meters is around 700 to 900 euros a month. This is sharing house with someone. Minimum wage is at the moment 1,300 euros a month.
Okay.
So it roughly, plus you need to have enough insurance, of course, to be able to work. That's an extra 100 euros you need to pay every month. So already you don't have much left over to live. So of course, actually, young users will not most probably go to a coffee shop, pay cannabis at 10, 13, 15 euros a gram, and will still, of course, try to see a very regular dealer that will sell them the same quality cannabis half the price.
Right. Thank you for that. It's just about time for us to assemble ourselves for the Cannabis March and Rally, the law reform rally every year at this time. Just before we wrap and thank people, though, I just ask, at the beginning of the panel, I asked the answers for the question of what do we avoid? What's the simple thing? There might be answers, there might not be, but I asked each panel member to think about, if they've got a short way they can say, what's the big step to avoid, the big mistake that might be avoided that other countries have fallen into? Is there a way that we can avoid that? Any answers? There might not be. Yeah, anyone. Well, everyone's got their homework, so Ray, your homework.
The future Canadian model that they're working on now, I believe, will be the ideal, which is regulated, decriminalised, treated like any other pharmaceutical substance, including natural substances. I think that's the way to go.
Thank you, Ray. Sita, any final wisdom?
I just want to make sure that they think about including the people that are in the industry already, all the hard workers that are working in the dispensary at the Hemp Embassy. They have so much knowledge. And in Canada, all that knowledge from all the dispensaries that were closed, those people no longer have jobs, and there's nowhere for them to disperse their knowledge anymore. So we've lost all this huge body of knowledge of people who were helping people. So if you're going to have a medical model, you need to keep those people in, whether they've been associated in the illegal market or not. That's got to be overcome, because that's the biggest thing in Canada, is those thousands of workers in the dispensaries, the growers, the mom and pop growers that have all the experience in growing, have had to shut down. Like Patrick said, $1,000 a pound is just about what it costs if you're growing it indoors.
Thank you. And thanks, Steve, for putting this on, and thank you to all the other panellists. It's been really interesting, and for me as a politician, I'm learning a lot, and I think I am of the belief at this point in time that Canada does provide us in Australia with a roadmap for regulation and legalisation. But I really take on board, and I made Nick make a note for me, around small business. And Aurora's already here. All of those big Canadian companies are already here, and it's ensuring that we keep that focus on that small to medium business and enabling them to take part in it, and ensuring that we do not exclude the people who have been part of this industry. I mean, the police in Victoria say it's worth $1.1 billion every year. So there is a big expertise out there, and I think those are the things I've learned to ensure that we don't exclude people that have been involved in the industry in the grey market.
Thank you. And Charly?
Well, everything has mostly been said, yeah, of course. For now several decades, the cannabis industry became an industry underground or on the legal side. But actors have been here, they've been working and actually doing a pretty good job, no matter if regulations were here or not. Those people actually can make things work. The moment you get them out, for example, I was see in the Netherlands, they were thinking about making a permit system like in Canada, but it will take you out actually as soon as you had any cannabis-related offense. So if you had any offense related to cannabis grower, that actually will stop you for being an official cannabis grower. Yes, but this is what I do. This is what I've been doing.
In Canada, it's so bad if you've had any action, if you've had anything to do with anybody that's had any illegal activity, if you were seen in a parking lot 5 years ago, they may have noted that down. If you're seen talking to somebody, a gangster in a parking lot 5 years ago, the man may have dropped his wallet, but that's how far they're going with the making sure that you're a clean person and you're not a gangster.
Yeah. And in the other hand, also there's something, well, after that, it will take definitely way much more time. But already once, actually, all different governments, country by country, finally have their regulations done. On an international level, we have experience of United States, Canada, on other countries like the Netherlands, Spain,
Uruguay.
Morocco, Colombia, Uruguay, just for citing very few of them. So many countries with actually huge, massive scale cannabis production and experienced grower could definitely already actually help providing all this quantity of cannabis that are needed for either recreational or medical uses. But working on international regulations of cannabis will definitely take much more time. Let's first of all maybe do things country by country and finally get things sorted out, I guess.
Thank you. Patrick.
Well, I guess almost everything's been said already as for fixing the problem. I just would like to also point out what's been said earlier. Let's add what Portugal, or sorry, was it Portugal is doing, where they have the intake. If someone has been arrested or accosted for drug use, first they see a counselor. That just makes the most sense in the world. Every single drug-related pickup from the police should first go to a counselor, determine if there's any mental health issues or anything larger that they're coping with, and then perhaps if they're not a health issue, then they can go into the criminal system. Because right now, everyone goes into the criminal system. And if you don't think you should be in the criminal system, it's on you as the victim or as the patient to make that clear that you are not in the criminal system, you actually should be in the health system. So anyway, I just wanted to point out that should be the first. Kudos to Portugal for doing that.
Cool. Thank you for that. And David, any comment?
Yeah, I'd like to echo the point about exclusion, and I think that it goes, even wider than mom and pops and small-time businesses, right? I think it's important to remember, to come at it sort of from left field, right? That social peace is an illusion. The way that our societies are structured, all of the rules, all of the laws, everything in place presents different balances of power. And so when we look at what we see as peace, when we step outside and don't see ongoing riots and immediate action from police, right? There are certain rules that are in place. People have set up these legal systems, people have set up these rules, and we're playing on that terrain. The way that things are don't have to be the way that they are, they just happen to be the way that they are right now. And so I think rather than accepting those things as legitimate, it's important for us to recognize as we push into greater decriminalized or legalized spaces, to be aware of the people that are coming along, to be aware of the people who fall outside of that, to be aware of the people who are crafting the legislation and what their personal and class and racial and corporate interests are, and to try to be aware of these things as they come out. And I think, for folks who are outside of those legal structures or political structures, to sort of hold our politicians' feet to the fire, right? Like they're in that position, and as I acknowledged earlier, they have to play where the rubber meets the road, but we don't necessarily. And I think the more vivid our imaginations are, the more vivid realities we can bring into being.
Thank you. Thank you. And while
he should run for office.
Keep clapping, keep clapping. Let me just take the moment to thank the panel members, Ray, Sita, Fiona, Charly, Patrick and David. Thank you very much for each of your contributions. I thought that was a great discussion myself, and I thank you for the time and effort that people are putting. It's coming from a long way away from, in many cases. And thank you also to the people in the audience who asked questions, made comments, and everyone else who participated by being here. Being here is important, but it's not enough. Being here is good, but we've got to take part. The way change happens is by taking part in things. Being here is a good start. A rally's about to start in maybe 20 minutes or so. Time to get a glass of water, a cup of coffee, make other preparations if you need to join in the rally.
So do your hair.
We've got a few minutes before that starts.
Green glitter.
The important message is, I think, take part. Be in the march, be at the rally. Take part in the events today, take part in the events at MardiGrass, and when we're finished at the end of the day, the end of the weekend, continue to take part in the struggle for sensible drug law reform in this country. We are inspired by the experiences of other countries. It can be done. We can do it too. Thanks very much.